Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of our Rome recap series. This week, I think we're on episode 4, so we're back on track. We're trying to get them out every week, so make sure you stay tuned. This week, we touched on a bunch of different areas. We start by exploring one of Jordan B Petersons' papers on 3 forms of meaning and the management of complexity. It all sounds a bit intense, and I'm not going to lie, it does get a bit deep, but there's no getting around that. We also talk about categories in regards to high and low resolution. We touch on goals and their orientation. We're also touching on perception. We're starting to talk a lot about attention and how that all ties in with making different goals. And lastly, we touch on clarity and assumptions. And when there's not much clarity and there's a lot of vagueness, there is room to make assumptions. So if any of that sounds interesting, make sure you give it a listen. And if you enjoy it, then make sure you follow us on any one of our platforms. Anyway, I won't hold you any longer. Here you are. Hello listeners, you are listening to the Wise Words Rome Recap podcast. Rome Research is a note-taking tool for networking thought. Both myself and Jes use it, and so we have decided to review some of our weekly notes that you may not have heard of in our book review episodes. So if you like what you hear, make sure you hit that follow button, and if you have any thoughts of your own on any of the multiple subjects we talk about, why not leave us a comment or send us a DM to our Instagram at WiseWordsBlog. Until then, enjoy. All right, mate. Well, start us off.
Well, we've recently been, you've been today and me the last couple of days, we've been reading Jordan Peterson's paper, 3 Forms of Meaning and the Management of Complexity. So one of the interesting things I got away, immediately off the bat, I don't know if you did as well, he mentioned something called the frame problem in AI.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you looked into it or not.
I haven't before. I only just seen it.
Mate, to be honest, it's the first time I've seen it too. I've got the PDF I can send to you. I still haven't read it myself, but I kind of get the rough idea, right? So I was trying to say this to you earlier when we spoke. So if you have a sensory machine, so something that, takes in audio, for example, you obviously give it a range of things to listen to. So with audio, for example, it can be a specific wavelength of sound, right? And his point is there's a massive, I think the point is there's a massive problem when it comes to multi-sensory experience to make sense of everything. If that makes sense to you. So you're listening to this wavelength here, you're visually looking at this wavelength for light, etc., right? Taste, I don't even know how taste works, right? Okay, I'm butchering this, but this idea that with AI, it's very narrow. It's always take this set of data in a sound spectrum and work out with this set of data, but it can't do multi-sensory experience. So that makes sense. So AI at the moment is very it's very well trained in narrow dimensions. So it'll do really well at picking up electromagnetic waves, but it won't do well at amalgamating two. But that's what your brain does, if that makes any sense. Because basically the problem is almost, especially also with the wavelengths of sound and stuff, right? There's almost a potentially infinite amount of variability.
Yeah.
So the point of the frame is really taking the variability that matters. So for example, I guess you could say humans can only see visible light, right? Or you've heard of that, right? There's only a specific amount of electromagnetic wave our eyes can detect.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean the other stuff doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And the point of the frame problem is, where do you cut off the frame, essentially? Where do you have the frame of all that data that's in front of you, all the wavelengths that are going, if that makes sense? There's an infinite amount of shit going on everywhere. How do you, as a computer which just does logic, how do you figure out where to cut off and where to ignore?
This is it. We were talking about this earlier on in regards to a fly, or basically the relevance. Mm-hmm. So you are the reference point and whatever is relevant to you. So if you're a fly, then little particles of dust or whatever, are going to be more relevant than if you're a human. So you're going to adapt to that kind of thing. So if we adapt to seeing visible light, it doesn't mean that other light doesn't exist. It's just that we haven't found it relevant to
I
us.
was about to say this is why some stuff like some of the physics is so hard to get your head around, because it's like not intuitive, if that makes sense. Because we're talking about things you can't see.
Yeah.
So how can you intuit something that you can't see, or you can't mold?
You're ignorant of it. Really,
I kind of liked this idea as well, like the perception, like your perception in general is the essence of intelligence, in being that like your body has already solved the hard problems, like in the sense that it's already condensed all this complicated reality, like, so if you take, for example, the fact that cells exist and atoms exist, right? Our eyes don't see that because it is irrelevant, so we've taken all this fucking data that we could, right? And then we've just ignored most of it and created like whole. So for example, right, I mean, this like head case here, this is made out of different materials, right? And if you went deep in with a microscope, you'd see all the different particles, but our brain doesn't see that, it just sees the whole, if that makes sense. And that's because what's the fucking point in seeing all the details when you don't need to? So like this idea that like perception is almost attuned to the individual, bit like what you're saying about flies, right? Like a fly's that small. I don't think his eyes can see the way we see it. It sees other things infinitely smaller, but relevant to its environment.
Yeah.
And I think this is point. It's like we frame what we have. I guess we have the human frame or the human perception, which other animals wouldn't have. And we all have different sort of perceptions, as you will, right? Apparently birds can see air currents.
Yeah.
But it's all relevant to your environment and to, I guess, the survival.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And it's something we really take for granted. That's what I kind of gathered from it.
Well, yeah. No, absolutely. And it's like interesting because, if all these things are basically just information that we're interpreting and then we're translating it so that we can understand it, it's interesting that other animals, so for instance, like a bat works off echolocation and it's adapted to that. So it's like, and like you just said, birds can see air currents. It's like there's all this information out there.
Yeah.
It's just being translated into
it's almost interesting, right? Because the information's relative or relevant for that survival mechanism or the hunting mechanism of the animal.
Yeah.
So like bats, obviously, they're blind, right? Am I right to think that? And they just detect things off their echolocation sort of thing, or they scream and then they hear the rebounds off something like that, right? Sorry. And then in my head, it's almost been attuned because it's relevant to the particular environment or the particular way it's been developed to survive in an environment, kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
It almost evolves to solve the problems that it needs to solve in terms of like eating or hunting, etc. With the limited capabilities it has, i.e., it's blind. How do you get around that? It's one of those things. I think what I find really interesting about, I don't know if you've seen the gorilla video, right?
The change blindness.
Yeah, the change blindness one. But like, have you seen the one which Jordan Peterson shows, which is like, it's change blindness in the sense that the gorilla comes on, right?
But then
yes, exactly that. The curtains in the background change and somebody disappears.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing because like, I was being all cocky and I knew the gorilla, so I was looking out for the gorilla, right? And I missed the rest of it.
Yeah.
And it's phenomenal because like, the first time you do it, you're counting. Like if you say to somebody, like let's say they didn't know, and you were just like, "Oh, check this out! I bet you can't count the amount of throws they do. Everybody gets it wrong." They'll immediately be like so engrossed into counting it, and then they might miss the gorilla. And then the second time they'll see the gorilla, but then they won't notice the color of the curtain change
because you only look what's relevant to your goal.
Mm-hmm.
You're blind to anything that's basically irrelevant. And it's so interesting when you think like on a day-to-day basis how ingrained we are in our kind of like rituals and routine and how much we must miss. There must be so much that we just aren't even aware of. Well, because we're just not looking for it.
I guess this is like classic, like what artists do is they sort of like re-look at things for the first time. If you kind of get what I mean, like really look at people. So like, let's just say walking in the subway, like instead of just like glancing at somebody and then walking away, like, because when you glance, I feel like when you just get that first initial impression, you project onto so many people. Do you get what I mean? Like you take an instance and you project the rest. But if you really stare at somebody and watch them, I mean, it's pretty creepy. Like you probably get like, arrested for doing it. But I think you'd be surprised at how much of the stuff that you're missing if you don't pay attention. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's quite interesting. That's like when you're on the tube and you look at people and it's like normally it's like a glance because you just can't you wouldn't lock eyes with someone, it would be deemed a bit weird. But when you do like when something does capture your eye, you then, it's almost like your focus, like whatever like grabs your attention, you focus on, and then you start to see more and more and more, you know, because you're kind of intrigued, and that's like your goal. Oh, which is interesting in terms of like going back to your AI
frame
concept,
thing.
frame thing that you were talking about. I was talking with my mate the other day, and he was talking about a book. I can't remember what it is. I can't remember if it's the Human Edge or something, or why people with the right brain are going to rule the world, that kind of thing.
Okay, yeah.
And it was kind of talking about to overcome like robots taking over jobs and things like that. You have a better chance if you become basically more human, which is basically like more kind of empathic, and in a way, one of the points was like curiosity. Like one of the main things that we've been able to do is like be curious about something and kind of pursue that. Whereas like a robot doesn't really have curiosity. You don't know how to program curiosity. So which is quite interesting in terms of like goal orientation. It's like curiosity. I wonder how that relates to goals in terms of like, is it something that just comes across and then like suddenly jump on that? Or?
I think interestingly with the curiosity thing, so if you look at like what the Peterson model is, right? So you have a expectation or desire based on your goal. So like you expect something to happen, right? So it's something doesn't quite work the way you want it to, right? And then you pause and you either see whatever it is as an obstacle, or you see it as like a tool. That's his main point. Like the positive thing is you go, how can I use this to go further into my goal? The other one's like, oh my God, how is this stopping me? I think interestingly, like the curiosity response. So the way I look at it, right? Something gets in your way of a goal. You can either sit there and categorize it into a rule you already have. So let's just say something happens and you're like, this guy's stopping me doing it. People are inherently selfish. You categorize that behavior as selfish. Okay, and then you think nothing else of it. Or you could be curious and you think, okay, hang on a second, this guy's being a bit weird. Let's find out more about the situation. And then you go into the situation, maybe ask, why are you getting in my way, for example, right? And then you figure out more about the actual situation, like why that guy is. Let's hypothetically now say you're going into a store and somebody just walks in front of you, blocks you.
Yeah.
Okay. And you can either be selfish, he's trying to, like, you can come up with all your answers and put that straight into your left and then sit there and just be like, okay, right, that's the reality. Or you can try and find out more, which is the curiosity thing.
Yeah.
So I feel like the way curiosity comes about is the more you read into things, right, or learn more about like the depth of the simple. So like the depth of things which you've never really thought about, like we were speaking about evil, you then start to realize that you try and remove the response of like straight away coming up with an answer and starting to think, is this the actual answer? If that makes sense. So you're looking at it going, actually, hang on a second, am I right to just assume this? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does, because also I relate to your point about you sometimes talk about the idea of like, I can't remember what it's called, the something bed, where it stretches.
Proscution bed, yeah. Proscution, I don't even know how to pronounce it, but yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so basically, if you come across a problem, and like you said, you have the option of either categorizing it or being curious and pursuing it, and then finding almost like just actually looking at the whole problem rather than just like trying to sweep it away. And I think the categorizing can sometimes almost be that Proscution bed. It's like you don't tackle it, so you 100% categorize it without actually like approaching it fully.
I'm convinced that's the case, mate. Yeah.
Whereas pursuing it with curiosity kind of goes into what I talk about in terms of like it makes the fuller experience. The palette, or like the blue palette that I talk about sometimes, where like you've got a generic blue color, and then when you experience something, it like you put it in and it changes the color altogether.
Yeah.
This is going to sound crazy to anyone who's listening to this because they don't know the context of it. But basically just the idea that like when you actually pursue the problem, pursue that curiosity, it makes almost the process to get to your goal even bigger because you understand more of it. You understand the, like side routes that are going off it.
Well, I think the best way of thinking about that is you understand more of it, because obviously there's way more to any situation than meets the eye, as we just found out by this whole chat, is like we ignore most of it, right? So this ability to be curious and explore more, you reveal more to yourself and you see more, and therefore you can react better, if that that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, this is why I think I do really sort of now that I've thought about it quite a lot, like the Peterson school of thought, or I wouldn't even call it the Peterson school of thought, but like this idea of like exploring complexity and how everything actually isn't so neatly categorized as we want it to be. I think it's just the truth, isn't it? Like that's the closest I could think of truth, which is like there isn't really one, and that we are always learning, if that makes sense. And it's always individual based, because once again, if you have this goal and you only see the things that are relevant to the goal, therefore the things you see are relevant to you and you individually, because you all have different goals. If that makes any sense. But yeah, I'm trying to think what else I can think of that.
I'll I remember watching one of Jordan Petersons' lectures, and he was talking about the actually I can't even remember if it was a lecture or in his 12 Rules for Life, but the idea of categorizing, like when you're a child and you don't understand what a dog is yet, you can assume that a cat is part of the same category as a dog because it's got 4 legs and tail, right? Because that's the rule that has been used to categorize what. But then you can apply behavior and like, you know, that a dog barks and that kind of thing. But what's interesting is that like we have categories ourselves that we haven't fully explored yet. So we can't be able to differentiate between certain categories and other categories. And so like you just said, when you come across a problem and you have the option of just, you know, chucking it in a category, maybe if we had pursued that, we would understand that, wait a minute, that actually has different properties from this category and it can't go in there anymore. So when you're using these kind of problem solving tools, I wonder if sometimes we elicit, like we bring up these kind of categories or tools to help us, but sometimes they're not in the right kind of section. They haven't been categorized properly.
I mean, I wanted to bounce on that a little bit just because I like this idea of like, it depends on the resolution you're looking at. So for example, if you look at the atomic level of a cat, you could be like, okay, right, this many hydrogen atoms, this many, you know, oxygen atoms. And then obviously you can turn it into like genetics, like the genetic level of cat. Is that truly what a cat is? Or is a cat what the behavior is? Or is a cat the whole thing?
Exactly.
like the genes,
the cat is a label,
the behavior.
It's like all of it? Or...
Like, no, exactly that. And it's so interesting. Like, I remember it was in, what book was it in? I think it might even be Matsamini. This is like what the Lakoff book is, which is right here. I still need to get around to reading it. Like, with these categories, they are so much more deep than we even realize. Like, if I ask somebody what's a cat, you'd be like, oh, you know what a cat is? I'll be like, no, what is it? Like, if you had to explain it to an alien, how would you? Oh, it's got 4 legs. A lot of things have 4 legs. Oh, it's got fur. A lot of things have fur. It has a tail. Oh, everything. Like, loads of things have tails. It's like, oh, but I know one when I see one. And that's the answer, isn't it? You're like, this is what I find so interesting. We know more with these concepts just through like triangulating like visual behavior recognition, you know, smell potentially as well. And it's all integrated into this concept of a cat. Which you can't even explain half of it.
What's interesting though is that the category that we talk about, is normally to a basic level that you can converse with other people on. Unless they also have a deeper knowledge of that category. So with the example of a cat, you know, you can zoom in or out. You can zoom out and be like it's a feline, then you could zoom out and be like it's a mammal, then you could zoom out and it's like it's an animal, or you could zoom in like you just said. So it's interesting that like we choose a certain point to be like, oh a cat ran down the road the other day, and you kind of know it because you're using a basic way to describe it. But you know, if you were to go into more depth, the other person would have to have that knowledge.
It's I guess it's interesting because obviously it makes sense for a cat to be in a human mind, like the sort of behavior and the look, if that makes sense. Because we can't perceive atoms. So it would be fucking useless to describe a cat as atoms, if that makes sense. So like there is a level of correct categorization in my head. This is getting pretty deep, but like there must be a level of correct categorization which is perceptible by humans and makes sense for humans. If you get that,
I think that it has to. Obviously, it's context dependent, right? It depends what you're talking about, but I think it has to be simplified, but to a point that can also make sense with the context. So, for instance, if I said, "Oh, a mammal walked down the road the other day," and I'm talking about a cat, it's like you don't understand. Like it's too simplified. Whereas like if I said, if you get what I mean, like obviously a mammal is its own category, but yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to get at like the idea that it has to be simplified enough to understand it, and that's it. Yeah,
Yeah, he kind of touches on this, by the way. He touches on it in this essay, going like the aspects of the things that we kind of like perceive, right? It has to be like structurally relevant for us to pick out, right? In the sense that you can pick out the outline of a cat with our eyes. Like you don't see the atoms, like you see like the way it is, the way the light reflects off into your eyes, right?
Yeah.
And then it has to stay like that for a relevant time frame. So like a biologically relevant length of time. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So like a cat stays pretty stable because basically a cat's a cat until it dies and then it decomposes and then what is it?
Yeah.
This is the point, cat. Right? Because it's transforming. This is the whole point. It's never it's like at this moment you could say that as a cat. At this moment in time. This is back to like the context. In 10, 15 years, you could say that's a dead cat. Yeah. or just, bones.
Yeah.
But is it still a cat? I don't know.
Well, it's interesting because like the labels that we use are static once again, aren't they? So they can't take into consideration the transformation because it's changed. The properties have changed from what we used to describe what a cat was. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you could go around in circles. Like if you just do this time frame thing, be like, oh well, it doesn't exist because in 50 years' time it doesn't exist. But it's like obviously here and the now, this is like. It's relevant to categorize it that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think another interesting point he made is this idea that like as the entire universe obviously is consistently changing, let alone the world is just consistently changing, there is no complete perception that will ever grasp it all, if that kind of makes sense. So like his idea is that like the variety of life is because of this idea that there has to be a variety of different ways of trying to survive. If you kind of get me, with so much change in different environments, there has to be a variety of life, a way of strategies to survive. That kind of makes sense. Like the whole idea of this random genetic mutation is to randomly evolve to try and hopefully survive in an environment.
Well, this is it. Yeah.
Interestingly, I was thinking like over time. So like back to this like. Order and chaos, right?
Mm-hmm.
The very beginning of order is cells that self-replicate or find a way to reflexively move against the environment, if that makes sense. So the starting of survival is having something that's alive that detects danger and then moves away from it, if you kind of get me. And obviously over millions of years, this builds up into a complex mammal that you get like a human, right? And his point is there is still part of us that is definitely rule orientated in the sense of like our mitochondria and some of our cells have been operating together for like hundreds of millions of years, and that's very stable, if that makes sense. So there is parts of us that are very stable. So like there is in this weird way, so the world's always transforming, but there is this stability in the middle, which is like almost the core, like that classic, like what I was saying to you about the hypothalamus earlier, which continues to help you breathe and all these things. Like that core has existed for millions and millions of years, which shows like the stuff which sticks around tends to be the one that's most successful. If that does that make sense? Like evolutionary speaking, right? And it's interesting because this is when he goes into his classic argument of like the dominance hierarchy, because it's like that has existed across animal species for millions and millions of years. So there must be a reason for it.
And things that stand the test of time, there's a reason.
It's like the classic Nassim Lindy effect. Like if a book's still famous now, there's probably a reason for it. But like another thing is like if something survived over time, there's a reason why it survived.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think quite interestingly, like one of Peterson's main points, which which makes sense, like it'd be hard to prove not wrong, is like we started off as this stem of consistent, stable things. So, for example, we're pretty much evolved to deal with oxygen, right? Like you put us on another planet and we struggle. Like there is a stability within us, which then we have grown more complex.
Yeah,
that kind of means like there's a core of us which is still there.
Yeah,
which is this whole idea of like you can, for example, he uses the Darwin, when a snake jumped at Darwin, he would always move back regardless, and he could never teach himself not to, which shows that there's something in him which is like automatically responding to that without him having any conscious. This is like back to the free will thing. There is some like core of humans that you can't change.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because, like, you know, that core, that's the oldest part, right? Like, the oldest part of your brain is pretty much the area that deals with these involuntary processes such as breathing and things like that.
Yeah.
So, you know, that is stable, and then over time, you know, the cells have kind of left and taken on a different function and tried to make that work and make that connect. And it's like almost the further it gets out, the less stable it gets, but its whole journey is trying to make it more stable. So, you know, the one here might be more stable, but this will be less and this will be less. Yeah. They're all doing, so these are more likely to evolve rather than this one, because this one has, you know, it's stood the longest amount of time, if you get what I mean.
Yeah, I think it's also, I think it's also interesting because it's more like, as well, that it's always, things are built on top of it. Like the stem is there, and then things are built on top of the stem, which is an interesting way of like looking at it. I think what's really interesting, and this is kind of off the topic of this, but it's back to this like hemispherical, because I don't know if we talked about this on the podcast yet, but like the hemispheres of the brain, and how there is a rough mapping for like left being rules, right being novelty, and they communicate. And obviously, a bit like what we were saying earlier, something happens, you check it into your left. Does it make sense? It does. Okay, we'll leave it there. Or it goes into your left, and then you can ask a question and bring it back out.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So like, oh, we could be angry, or it could be something else. Let's go out and check. And the right hand side's more exploratory. And this is what I do believe now to a T. It's like the chaos and order. Like perception, you can never take everything in, right? So you take everything you need to. You socialize. You take everything. You learn what you need to take in, right, based on your life experiences, and you keep that all put in the left, and the right is still there, just like looking for things that might be against it. And then the whole point of the right is to then find something, integrate it, bring it in, and then bring it into the left and have a more sophisticated left rule based side of your brain almost. But it's just mental, because I think what's more mental is the fact it's across like mammals. Like we all have the same brain, therefore we're all kind of optimizing for the same problem. If I don't know if it's the case, but I know for a fact with the rats, like I told you before, like you drop a rat into there's two examples. There's one where a rat's familiar in like a little sort of maze, and they drop a cat in. That's basically means he has his rule, like this whole area is safe. The cat comes in, shit, it's not safe. He then spends 24 hours sniffing around trying to work out if it's still safe, and 24 hours for a rat is like a month. That's pretty traumatic if you spend a month trying to figure out if there's a cat, you know. The point is, its brain, once again, and its reaction to it is based on like this idea of what's safe, or like what you've understood, and then something new happens. But like if all the animals' brains are like that, that's because that's the reality of the way everything works. Is like you only have a certain amount you can know, and then there's going to be something else that you don't know that comes in. And you're either going to have to see it and figure out what that means, or I guess you could just look at it and try and shove it into one of your categories already, or like, I don't know, or you get eaten, or you die, or some form.
But I think what's interesting is if you try and shove it into a category there, and then you come across that problem, then you can see that it doesn't add up.
I've just thought of something really, really interesting as well. So these categories on the left, so you have this ideas of the way the world works, and you just see through experience, does it fit into like this explanation, maybe, as you will. You have like a left-hand brain as a load of explanations or concepts that you think run the world, right? Vague concepts, so stuff which you've not really properly articulated, can fit in a lot of things. So back to like this sort of like far left power dimension, oppression, you can shove a hell of a lot of stuff in the oppression category. Like every single, you could literally judge every single time you meet somebody as there's an oppressor and an oppressed, and you could do it, and you could use little mini clues like, oh, he talks more, so he's oppressing me. You know. But like this is what I mean when you have such. This is, I think, is we're going to speak about it like the tell the truth or at least don't lie. Or sorry, be precise in your speech. When the concept's vague and it can have a lot of different things in, you can just slot in so many things. Do you get me? Like Yeah, I think that's probably a very good example of the power one, a bit like the lens, just because it's such a hard to define concept power. Because there's physical power, isn't there? There's like actual like abusive physical power. Then there's apparently mental power. Then there's also like wealth power, I guess you could argue. There's status power. There's so many dimensions to it. And then we sort of all encapsulate it. And then you could judge every single fucking, interaction you have through this lens. And that just reinforces this category on the left. This thing is getting big, full of all this stuff, right? And I remember what Peterson said, like, or basically what trauma is where you completely undermine like an axiom. So by the time you filled all this fucking shit into this power thing, if you were then to realize this power thing didn't exist and that it was just a not that it doesn't exist, right? Or that it's not, it shouldn't have all that junk in it. Then like the whole point I think Peterson said, or the idea, like the rough idea is that like, on the right you build up a counter argument, and when it gets bigger than the left you swap them. But no wonder people don't want to change their mind if they've built up such a collection of like why they're right. They've literally got this fat like life experience. Everything's been viewed through this lens for like 2 years, and then you're telling them that it doesn't exist. It must be pretty painful, mate.
So if you're so I'm thinking like if you're trying to categorize something and you put that piece of information into a category, does it change what the category is as a whole? Or does it fit within that rule of what that category is? If you have a category for what, I don't know, a cat is, and then you put something else in there, does it change what the idea of a cat is? Or is it like you can only put things in there that are strictly to that rule?
I think strictly to the rule, right, in my head, or similar. I think, fine. The example in this categorical thinking, like one of the concepts is prototypical thinking, which is like you have a prototype of something. So you have a prototype of what maybe like, let's just say it was power. You have a prototype enactment in your head of what a power dynamic would look like between two people. But then that can expand if you haven't been very specific. If you kind of get me. So for example, you could expand your cat domain to lions because they're very similar, but they're not the same. If you kind of get me, you could expand it really, like if you're being lazy and you weren't being very precise, is like what Peterson's point is, like if you're not being precise in your thoughts and like trying to nitpick exactly what you mean, then things will expand. And I would say it's the same with like language. Like some things like language evolves over time to encapsulate more and more. If you kind of get me, like people use it when it shouldn't be used, and it kind of grows. So with this category stuff, especially stuff like power, when power can be interpreted multiple ways.
Well, it's quite an abstract concept.
It's an abstract concept, and it's also based on social behavior, but also what it requires, right, is knowing kind of the intent of the other person. Because if they were just like, oh, maybe they're just really extroverted, they just like, they're just really loud. But if you are somebody who interprets it as power, you haven't got his side. You haven't asked them. This is like the whole point.
It's the misinterpretation of it. If you're looking at someone and you don't have a proper definition of what power is, and then you see someone laughing at you, then you can construe that as
I think another really interesting thing was like this idea of like, projection in psychology, or like the idea of you project onto people stuff. So in my head, if you've created all these sort of rules and categories on your left, and they're very powerful because they're very useful tools for like seeing the world, right? It's almost like the left's like the model you have of everything and how it all works. If you see somebody and you can't explain their behavior, you're going to resort to power. Like you're going to resort to this thing that's got the strongest neural connections almost, right? You're going to sort of see them, and then you're going to project onto them because you like I said, if it's just like a one-off occasion and this guy's just being really loud, or maybe he interrupted you, he could be. So you now see that as like it goes into your nervous system, whatever, and you sort of go, fine, oh, that's power, because that's how you diagnose most things. But in reality, this is the curiosity thing. Like it pays to be able to just hold fire on your categorization, and be like, hang on, or judgment, you could call it, and just be like, hang on a second, oh sorry, like it'll be like, oh sorry, I found it really rude when you interrupted with me. And they might even be like, oh so sorry, I was really excited. And then you're like, then it's not power, he was just excited.
Exactly. But it's adding more information to the context at hand. If you don't have much information,
then you project. This is my point. So like if you have a big build up, you will project.
You make assumptions about what is occurring. And it's interesting because I think we talked about this in regards to like the value structures or the different hierarchies. And I think when there isn't much information there, it's like when you're in like a novel situation, you don't know what to do. It's like, it's like freeze, flight, or fight, and the first thing that kind of pops up, the main hierarchy that comes up is pretty much dominance, and dominance is power in a way. So it's not
Yeah.
it's not a stretch to imagine that, like, when you are in a novel situation and you do interpret certain cues in relation to a dominance hierarchy or a dominance cue in a way.
I think is interesting because, like, human life, there's so many, like, what's the best way of putting it? Like, paradoxes. For example, right, you could be the top of a dominance hierarchy and be powerful, but also like be nice. But like we almost always encapsulate it with the rule of like if they're the top of the dominance hierarchy, it means they're like oppressive. There can be dimensions of it that are oppressive, and there can be dimensions of it are not. So like it's both at the same time. Does that make sense? It's like it's not just one or the other. It's like both, or it's like a spectrum of either.
It's like a dial chart on like in like a studio, in like a music studio. You've got all the dials, and it's like some can be up to the top, but in others it means that it can be at the bottom. And I get what you mean, as in like we make assumptions about like the connotations towards a certain hierarchy, as dominance must be like brutal strength all the time. And that
there's a quote like Aristotle, somebody, and it was like one of the best ways about having success is to actually deserve it. And like there are some people, like if you, like for example Elon Musk, mate, he's never really attacked, is he? So there's a lot of people who are attacked for their wealth.
I don't know, but
from what I can see, he's not. So for example, Bezos is attacked quite a lot, and there is arguments to be had why billionaires or these type of multi-billionaires shouldn't exist, right? But it's amazing how Elon, because of his like not self-serving, complete opposite, the collective serving attitude of like flying to Mars and stuff, he's almost like vindicated for his success, because he was richer than Bezos a couple of days ago, and people like support him. And it's just amazing how like who's successful and somebody who's equally successful, and actually if anything Amazon do more for the common person in terms of the ability to afford stuff cheap and next day, one gets villainized and one doesn't. I just find it really interesting how public opinion can shift on that, and categories like I feel like most of these arguments always end up one dimensional. So for example, billionaires are evil, okay, what ways are they not? This boat, and like I saw, I think it was Chris Williamson tweeted yesterday, and it was something like somebody been saying on Twitter like, what's the point of having like two sides to an argument? You got to have the conviction of your side. And he was like, this is somebody who like can't even see the opposite side. Like you shouldn't be able to have an argument unless you can at least argue the opposite side as well, to understand the fact that there is limitations to what you're saying. Like there is drawbacks. There's always a trade-off to what you're saying, or like a argument against what you're saying. And it's just,
but this is it. I think the more you talk to someone, like the length of the talk you have with someone, the more you can understand their intention behind it. When you make assumptions, you're making assumptions because first of all something is not clear, which is normally their intention, and so you make assumptions off that. Like once again, like where there is vagueness, there is room for you to project to fill that kind of what the intention is. You might have some of it, but you don't understand all of it. And that's a lot of what kind of happens with like political correctness in a way, whereby like, it's not that people don't judge the intention because they don't know the intention. They just straight away assume that this is why that person has said it. But like anything can be used badly if it has the wrong intention behind it, but it can also just, people can say stuff that don't necessarily.
It is interesting with this like being vague, and you have maneuverability, like it can easily be misinterpreted. There was I remember there's a book I was reading ages ago, and I really need to revisit it. It was called like Pragmatics of Human Communication, and there was like, he talks about two different types of communication, and one's digital and one's analog. Digital being like zeros or ones, so it's very like binary and direct, and it's like either or communication, like you can't really misinterpret. And he talks about analog, which is like analog communication would be like body language and other stuff which you can interpret multiple ways, and a lot of human communication is analog, which means it's very hard to understand, which means a lot of human suffering and like human disagreements are based on this idea of like, we're not straight up with each other. A lot of people aren't straight up with each other. They're just like, they kind of avoid issues. Like
And English
They won't
people
tell you the truth. Yeah, very, very much English
particularly,
people.
like we
Yeah.
just don't say what's on our mind. We beat around the bush, or like, you know, go through all these jumps and hoops to get what we want to what we want to say.
Mhm.
Yeah, that is really interesting, actually.
It's quite a good way of thinking of it in my head,
Mm.
especially as a lot of conversation is kind of analog in my head. Like a lot of it is, especially when it's interpreting people's motivations. It's very hard to.
Yeah,
Um,
and like the
yeah.
body language is quite interesting because like I've read a couple of body language books, but
Mm.
like
But
what it comes
even then,
down to is
it's
that
not direct, is it? It's not
what
like
this is it.
absolute.
And what it comes down to is the context. It's
Yeah,
like always
exactly.
context dependent. It's like no one can tell you exactly what someone is going to do in the future. It's like they can't, because they're not, you know, unless they're there with you during the context and they're like, by the way, he moved his knee, so this is what it means.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, it's always context dependent.
Well, yeah, exactly. We're all looking for this like what's it called, like secret recipe, secret formula to you know, diagnosing, or like a rule that's gonna the rule to rule all rules. You know, the thing that's gonna, you know, you're gonna be able to read body language, and now you're gonna know what everybody's thinking forever.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to know.
It's so interesting.
You wouldn't want to know. I don't think people might harbor like weird thoughts about you that you probably don't want to hear. You know, that type of thing. I don't think you actually do want to be omnipresent. Like, or what's it, omnipotent? What's the one where you know everything?
I get it confused.
I don't know, but either way, you don't want to. You actually don't. But I like the idea of having a little bit of insight into like body language. But you should never take it as like a be all end all rule. That's the same with anything. Like we've spoken about this before, prescriptions and stuff like.
Yeah. It's so interesting how much people want just like
a rule.
Or
like a formula. Like, or how do I get fit? Or this new workout program is going to sort me out. Okay, no. What's going to sort you out is if you just work out regularly and eat well.
Yeah.
Like, that's the truth.
Yeah.
It's hard work. Don't think it's gonna. I mean, I've learned that the hard way over the years. Fuck me. Like, I used to think like taking like muscle, you know, mass gainers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I used to think that was gonna sort me out, and I've come to this massive conclusion after like 8 years of trying that. You know, everything's much harder. Everything's much more complicated than it looks.
And everything's also subjective. It's like it's to the individual.
And I actually get sick now when I look at all these stupid like men's health thing, like,
oh mate,
you know, they just, in my head, they're just telling lies.
Well, it's because
they must know the truth. Like, they're just
it's thing is that I don't even think it's a lie, because what they're selling works for them.
And
right?
but the way it also does work, but it's like they don't tell you the hard truths, which is like you need to do it regularly, and you need to eat healthier. They're like, what I mean is it's always the magic pill, the magic formula. 7 steps to 6-pack abs in 3 months.
Yeah.
Well, because they context dependent. If you're like 50 stone, you're not going to have a 6-pack in 3 months.
What if you're 80? Is like, you know, like
it's mental, isn't it? And this is but this reminds me of that, like the rhetoric book, and this is a good point. If you ever ask for somebody for advice or something that you should do, if they haven't listened to your context, don't take their advice. Simple. That's a really good heuristic, and the more I think about it, it makes so much sense. If you go like, oh, doctor, should I do this? It depends. That's the first thing they should say. If they don't say that, goodbye. They don't have your best interests at heart. Simple. Because they have to understand where you're at first. Like, it's a bit like this what I was telling you about this, like A to B. You're always at A, always going for B. If they don't know where A is for you, how can they supply the B?
Yeah, exactly.
They don't know where the fuck you are. So why do they have like a rule up here?
And you don't really know where you are. So
like half the thing should be a mutual exploration of where you actually are and what you want. Then you go for B.
I think that's interesting, because it's like, you know, if you don't know where you are particularly, and yet someone provides you with this kind of goal, like, oh, you could get a 6-pack in 2 weeks, you know, then it's kind of like, it's nice to know, oh yeah, okay, there's something to look forward to, but you're completely blinded by the fact that, you know, first of all, it's bullshit, but also, you know, they're just selling like a cookie cutter process.
Of course, mate, it is exactly that. Yeah, I too fair, mate. I've fallen for my fair share of cookie cutter stuff, like schemes, whether it's weight loss or whatever, right? Yeah. And I have to say, I'm super cynical now, and I'm super bitter about it. So I genuinely look at it, and it makes me feel sick. Yeah. And it's a real problem, because I do think some of them do actually have the best intentions. Yeah. But I've just got this massive bullshit detector now. Like, if I sniff for a moment that you don't know what you're talking about, I will just switch off. Yeah. If you kind of get me.
Yeah.
which is bad because some of these people actually,
Well,
do actually know.
This is the thing. It's the case of like, judging whether you could try their rule or try their process and see if some of it works for you or some of it doesn't, because like, there's probably going to be an element of truth in all these kind of rules, but it's basically just trying them, extracting what worked for you and then making that yours,
Yeah. So it's always dependent on yourself, right? Like, yeah.
So much, mate.
Yes, the more I think about it, the more I was thinking also earlier about cold calling, and I was just thinking like, it really obviously depends on what you're selling, right? But like, you're calling somebody up, you don't know anything about them, and then you're going to try and sell them something. It's like, unless it's a universally applicable product, maybe like insurance or something.
Yeah.
What's the fucking point? Because essentially you're lying.
Yeah.
Because you're literally just like, hey, you need my product. It's like, no, I don't.
No, I don't.
You don't know anything about me. How do you get my number? It's mental. It's all, yeah. One sec. Let's have a look, my dude. I'm trying to think what else. I don't want to go on for too long, mate, only because I got stuff to do.
Yeah, man.
I mean, we could call it here. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, we could go into evil, but I think it's better if we went deep into that. Maybe with a thing with, like, maybe we just both talk about it one time. Maybe I'll save it for when you read it.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely.
I bought it earlier on.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, it's quite interesting how Peterson mentioned it before as well. Like reading Dostoevsky, whatever the name is, with Nietzsche. Like it's like pairing two things together. So like reading this evil book after doing a lot of Peterson stuff, it's more in depth, almost like it's really relevant right now. Maybe that's why I'm enjoying it more. It's a bit like the curiosity thing. It's like I'm kind of in the mood to learn about that stuff, so I'm enjoying it, especially now thinking about categories and abstractions, and evil is such a multifaceted, once again, sort of
it's
word.
It's really interesting. I wonder if curiosity basically plays a role in, like, you're going from A to B, you're interested in a particular area, you want to know more about, I don't know, religion and science and that kind of thing. And so curiosity is almost like a hunch saying like, oh, if you look here, you might find something good.
Yeah.
Like trying to, like, a potential link.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, but that is literally the exploratory sort of, what do you call it, rewards system sort of thing that Pearson talks about. Like, it's like, you're incentivized because you're curious, and there's like an open gap. We've spoken about this so many times before. Like, it's not like a concept that's well known. And this is like one of our own concepts, I guess. It's like the gap of knowledge, and your brain needs to fill it almost. This is why this is why these people who see something and then just swiftly categorize it or swiftly put it in its place are missing out on a trick, because they're missing the fact that could be explored a little bit. Yeah. Or you could update something, like you could have a bit more nuance in your perception, rather than just, oh, he's selfish, or this is this person, or it's so easy just to trigger happy. You go like, selfish person, okay, what about the context, what about his family life, what about this, what about that? There's so much to it. But yeah, I think mate, we'll probably leave it there then.
Let's call it there.
It's been fun.
It's been good.
Sweet, mate.